On January 20th, 2026, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney walked to the podium at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, and said something that no leader of a country sharing a 9,000-kilometer border with the United States had ever said in public, that the old relationship with Washington was over. By the next morning, United States President Donald Trump had called him personally. And what happened next revealed something about the balance of power in North America that both sides had preferred to leave unexamined. To understand the full weight of what unfolded in the months that followed, you need to go back to the spring of 2025, when the trade relationship that had defined the North American economy for 3 decades began to fracture under a specific set of political decisions made in Washington. Canada and the United States had built an economic partnership worth approximately $700 billion annually. More than 76% of Canada's goods exports were destined for the American market. That was not a trade relationship. That was a dependency. And in the spring of 2025, the Trump administration chose to treat that dependency as a pressure point. Tariffs were raised on Canadian goods to 35% across broad categories, falling outside the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. Section 232 tariffs, imposed under national security authority and therefore immune to ordinary legal challenge, hit Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, copper products, and kitchen cabinets. The political rationale had 2 components: reshape the trade relationship in Washington's favor and force a renegotiation of the Continental Trade Agreement known in Canada as CUSMA and in the United States as the USMCA. The agreement that Trump himself had signed in 2018 as the signature trade achievement of his first term was now, in his second, being called irrelevant. That is not a contradiction. That is a negotiating position. But here is what you also need to understand. Inside that trade pact sat a provision that nobody was discussing publicly, and it had been ticking since the moment it was inserted. On January 16, 2026, Canada and China reached an agreement. Under its terms, Beijing would lower tariffs on Canadian canola seed oil from 85% to 15%, effective March 1, 2026. Canadian canola meal, lobsters, crabs, and peas were released from Chinese anti-dumping tariffs through at least the end of 2026. In exchange, Canada agreed to allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into its market annually at a reduced tariff rate of 6.1%. Carney's office said the arrangement unlocked more than $7 billion in new export markets for Canadian farmers, ranchers, and fish harvesters. Then, 4 days later, Carney stood at Davos and condemned economic coercion by great powers against smaller nations. He did not mention Trump by name. He did not need to. Trump called him within the week. And there was a problem with the account that came out of that conversation. United States Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told Fox News on January 27, 2026, that during the Trump-Carney call, the Canadian Prime Minister had very aggressively walked back the remarks he made at Davos. That version of events, offered by a senior member of the Trump cabinet on a major broadcast platform, carried specific weight. If accurate, it meant that Carney's public defiance had collapsed the moment it reached the Oval Office, that the posture of sovereign resistance had been a performance, abandoned in private. Ottawa said something entirely different. Appearing before reporters that same morning as he entered a cabinet meeting, Carney was direct. He said that to be absolutely clear, and that he had said this to the president directly, he meant what he said in Davos. He told Trump about Canada's 12 new trade agreements across 4 continents, concluded in 6 months, and said Canada was responding to the fundamental change in United States trade policy. Carney then said Trump had been impressed by what he heard. But here is what you also need to understand. These 2 accounts cannot both be accurate. Either Carney retreated and then denied it publicly, which would represent a serious political miscalculation carrying enormous domestic consequences for a prime minister elected specifically on a platform of resisting American pressure. Or Bessent misrepresented the call, which would represent a deliberate attempt by the Trump administration to define Canada's posture before Ottawa could define it for itself. The analytical judgment is that Carney's statement, issued within hours, under camera scrutiny while walking into a cabinet meeting in both English and French is the more credible account. The absence of any formal transcript from that call is itself informative. It means both sides retain maximum flexibility to define what was agreed. In a trade negotiation that has not yet formally begun, that flexibility has a price. Trump's approach throughout this period has been consistent: raise the cost of noncompliance until the calculation in Ottawa changes. The tools have varied. A threatened 100% tariff on all Canadian exports if Ottawa finalized any trade arrangement with Beijing. Repeated suggestions that Canada should become the 51st state. A threat to block the opening of the New Gordy Howe International Bridge connecting Windsor, Ontario, to Detroit, Michigan, one of the most economically consequential border crossings on the continent. Each action is designed to narrow the decision space available to the Canadian government and isolate Ottawa from strategic alternatives. Carney's approach has been equally consistent and radically different. 12 new agreements, 4 continents, a $2.6 billion uranium supply deal with India, trade framework talks initiated with Australia and Japan, a new economic partnership with Qatar, an agreement with the United Kingdom that, according to TD Economics, drove more than 40% of British foreign direct investment filings toward Canadian software companies in 2025. The explicit goal is to reduce Canada's goods export dependence on the United States from 76% in 2024 to something approaching 50% by 2035. That is not an incremental course correction. That is a structural redesign of the Canadian economy, announced while an active trade war is in progress. That is not accidental. These are not press releases. They are measurable shifts visible in Canadian trade statistics. Annual goods exports from Canada to the United States fell 5.8% in 2025, and according to Global Affairs Canada, that decline was almost entirely offset by export growth to non-American partners. Canadian automobile production declined 5.4% across 2025, a direct consequence of Section 232 tariffs on vehicles and auto parts. On February 20th, 2026, the United States Supreme Court delivered a 6-3 ruling holding that President Trump had exceeded his authority under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act when he imposed the broad, sweeping tariffs of the previous year. Within hours of that ruling, Trump signed a new proclamation under Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, imposing a 10% global import surcharge, subsequently raised to 15%. Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement-compliant Canadian goods retained their tariff-free exemption. By December 2025, 89% of the value of Canadian goods exported to the United States qualified for that exemption under the agreement's rules of origin. The sectoral tariffs, steel at 50%, aluminum, automobiles, lumber, copper, were not touched by the Supreme Court ruling because they operate under entirely separate legal authority. The United States Trade Representative then launched a Section 301 investigation into Canada, citing alleged failures to enforce forced labor prohibitions in Canadian supply chains. A completed Section 301 investigation would allow Washington to impose new punitive tariffs with no statutory ceiling, and it could be completed before the July 1st, 2026 CUSMA review deadline. In practical terms, that 5.4% decline in Canadian automobile production translated into a specific reality for assembly workers in the Windsor-Essex corridor of southern Ontario, a manufacturing zone employing tens of thousands of workers producing vehicles and parts destined overwhelmingly for assembly plants across Michigan and Ohio. The corridor recorded its worst production year since 2020. For those workers, the CUSMA review was not a diplomatic milestone. It was the question of whether the next shift rotation would be posted. Step back from the specific mechanics of tariff schedules and trade pact provisions and look at what this moment actually represents. What Canada is doing in 2026 is not defensive maneuvering by a smaller economy absorbing punishment. It is a country redefining its strategic position on the North American continent for the first time since the original Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement of 1988. What Carney said in Davos was not a foreign policy speech. It was an announcement delivered before the assembled leadership of the global economic order that the premise undergirding the previous 3 decades, that ever deeper integration with the United States, was self-evidently in Canada's interest, no longer held as settled doctrine. Those words traveled to Beijing, to New Delhi, to Brussels, and to London. They were cited in strategic analysis from Chatham House to the Brookings Institution to the Eurasia Group. That in a relationship as consequential as this one may be the most important story of 2026. The July 1st, 2026 CUSMA review will be the defining test of everything built over the past 18 months. Under Article 34.7 of the agreement, a provision inserted at Washington's insistence during the 2017 renegotiation of the original North American Free Trade Agreement. And without precedent in modern free trade architecture, each of the 3 member countries must make one of 3 choices: renew the agreement for 16 years, withdraw from it on 6 months' notice, or signal non-renewal without formal withdrawal, which triggers mandatory annual reviews until the agreement expires in 2036. What is known is that as of March 6, 2026, formal face-to-face trade talks between Ottawa and Washington had only just resumed for the first time since Trump abruptly canceled them in October 2025, ostensibly in response to an Ontario government television advertisement featuring the late President Ronald Reagan criticizing tariffs. What is not yet known is whether the Section 301 investigation will be completed and deployed before the July deadline, whether the Trump administration will attempt to bifurcate CUSMA into separate bilateral agreements with Canada and Mexico, a move Ottawa has explicitly said it will resist, and whether Canada's negotiating assets, crude oil supply, critical minerals, and pension fund capital will be sufficient leverage to secure elimination of the sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles. What would confirm serious momentum toward a durable agreement is a formal framework document exchanged between negotiators before June 15, 2026. There is no such framework as of April 1, 2026. The honest assessment is this: the direction has changed. Canada has demonstrated more strategic flexibility in 18 months than it demonstrated in the previous decade. 12 agreements. A public posture that has not collapsed under sustained pressure from Washington. A new negotiating team, Ambassador Mark Wiseman and Chief Negotiator Janice Charette, deployed specifically for what comes in July. None of that eliminates the fundamental fact: 76% of Canadian goods still cross into the United States every year, and the sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, and automobiles remain fully in force. The July review will not resolve everything, but it will determine what the next decade looks like for both economies. That calculation is now being made in both capitals. The question that remains open is whether Canada arrives at the July 1st deadline with sufficient leverage to force real tariff relief on the industries that define its manufacturing base, or whether the CUSMA review simply locks in the current asymmetry for another decade of annual pressure under Article 34.7. If you have followed this situation over the past year, you already have a read on which direction this is heading. Put your assessment in the comments, and when July 1st arrives, this channel will return to see whose read was closest to what actually happened. The CUSMA review is not a single news event. It is a process that will generate critical signals every week from now through July, and the analysis of those signals is what this channel delivers. If you are not subscribed, you will have the headline without the context when the critical moment comes. Subscribe now, activate the notification bell, and you will have the full picture before the narrative is set.